Publix Supermarkets, the largest and fastest growing employee-owned supermarket chain in the world. Today, it's a Fortune 500 company and ranked as one of the best companies to work for in the United States. From humble beginnings in Winter Haven, Florida, Publix has revolutionized the way America buys food. The man behind it all is one of the most recognizable icons in the food industry, George Jenkins. Throughout his lifetime, George crafted a secret formula for success that continues to make Publix one of the most profitable supermarket companies.
My little secret of success may have been determined just to run a better grocery store than anybody else.
Harris City, Georgia, population 100. In this small farm town, 60 miles south of Atlanta, George and Annie Jenkins arrived in 1899 to begin a family. Their son, George Washington Jenkins, Jr., was born September 29, 1907. He was the fifth of their 8 children and the first boy in the Jenkins family. 2 other sons would follow, John in 1912 and Charlie in 1915.
Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us.
You know, they were very, very strict, and it was sort of, you've come into this world and you have abilities and talents, and you need to figure out what they are and you need to use them. Be appreciative of the things that you do have, and in terms of your your heart, your head, and, and go out and do good.
At the intersection of 2 country roads, in what was later described by George Jenkins as a one-horse town, the family built a general store.
Oh, it was a big country store, general store it was called. My daddy built it in, he was born in 1870. He built it when he was about 30 years old.
We didn't sell many groceries, just the various staples, lard and sugar and flour and coffee and tea. And one of the things I used to do is, when I was about 10, got my mother to help me parch in these big old wood stove peanuts, and put them in the little bags and sell them for 5 cents a bag. So they'd eat them and throw them on hubs all over the floor. So my father would make me come down and sweep out the floor early Monday morning, while the Saturday customers had littered it with peanut shells. But I could make $3 or $4 a day, which to a kid, that was a lot of money.
In 1915, misfortune struck the Jenkins. The 2-story house George Sr. built for his growing family caught fire. With no fire department to extinguish the flames, the house burned to the ground. 4 years later, a tiny creature with an insatiable appetite, the boll weevil, blazed a trail from Mexico to Georgia, devouring every field of cotton in its path and devastating the rural South by 1923.
He sold on credit, and he sold these farmers by the year. So they'd come in, his name was George, and I said, well, Mr. George, we're sorry we can't pay you. And so he went bankrupt.
To support his family, George Sr. moved to Atlanta. He left his son behind to liquidate the assets of the store and to take care of his mother and siblings.
He loaded watermelons on a truck. He worked as a lumberjack, a shoe salesman, and he drove a taxi as a young teenager. He was just trying to earn any money he could for the family.
He also worked as a grocery store clerk in Atlanta and was given a promotion after only 2 months.
He would relieve these managers in Atlanta on little stores where they didn't have a meat market. They just had kind of like a 7-Eleven store today. He would relieve those managers for a week while they went on vacation. So he just gravitated to that because that was what he knew.
In 1924, George, now 17, began to think of a college career.
He had always dreamed about going to Georgia Tech and becoming an engineer, and he was making plans to do that when he found out a friend of his was going down to Tampa to visit his sister. So he thought he would go down to Florida and find out what was going on in the real estate business. Perhaps he can make some money in real estate. But when he got to Tampa, he found out his friend's sister wasn't there. So he had to stay in this flop house overnight. He told me he had $9 that he rolled up in his sock and put in his pillowcase and hoped he wouldn't get robbed that night.
My plans were to go on down to Miami, hitchhike back to Atlanta and go to school. But we went on a Sunday with my friend to visit a friend of his who happened to own 14 Piggly Wiggly stores. And he talked me into going to work for him. And in about 6 weeks, he made me store manager over in St. Petersburg.
Once manager in St. Petersburg, George cleaned up and re-merchandised the store and increased weekly sales 5-fold, from $1,300 to $6,300 per week. He was soon promoted to manager of the Winter Haven store, the largest in the Piggly Wiggly chain, earning $45 per week. Still planning to attend Georgia Tech, George returned home to Atlanta in 1926.
Well, back then there was just dirt roads between Winter Haven and Atlanta, and it was a hard trip. It took him 2 days to drive to Atlanta, and sometimes he had to get alligators or cattle out of the road.
But there was little work for tech graduates in Georgia, and George returned to Winter Haven to his job at Piggly Wiggly. In the food industry, it was a time of transformation. The Old Town General Store was giving way to something new, and Piggly Wiggly was leading the way.
Well, you think about the 1920s where we in our industry had the small dry goods stores. Those dry goods stores existed by themselves, and then you'd go to your gardens to get your produce. You'd go to your local butcher to get your meat. And that's when changes started occurring in the industry to bring in fresh product, to bring in the meat department. We were moving away from full service, these small grocery stores, to self-service in the supermarket concept.
George managed the Piggly Wiggly store for 3 years as the chain expanded throughout Florida. But when the Great Depression hit, George's boss was forced to sell the store. Once again, he took the grueling trip from Winter Haven to Atlanta, this time to introduce himself to the new owner of the Piggly Wiggly chain.
Well, my father had some ideas about how to run a better store, and he decided to go to Atlanta to talk to the president of the company. So when he got there, the secretary told him that the president was too busy to talk to him. And my father said he overheard the president talking about playing golf, and that incensed him so much that he went back to Winter Haven and decided to open his own store right next to the Piggly Wiggly.
After that meeting, George vowed that if he ever found success in the food business, he would go around and visit his stores and see anyone who wanted to see him. By the time he returned to Winter Haven, he was determined to open his own store and run it his own way.
When he told his roommates, you know, they're pretty young. I don't think they're yet 30 years old. And he's telling his roommates he's going to open his own store in 1930, you know, the height of the Depression.
I tried as hard as I ever tried to do anything to interest my friends and neighbors in making a little investment in a new little grocery store. The newspaper, knowing they'll get some advertising out of it, they put up $100. The dairy people, to get the milk business, they put up $100. We had a 500-gallon gasoline tank in the ground of kerosene. We sold kerosene then. The fellow selling oil put up 100. The doctor there, my personal friend, he just thought he was throwing his money away, but he wanted encouragement, so he put up 100. All told, in several months of my brilliant salesmanship, I was able to get 5 people to put up $100 each for the first Publix.
Between these investments and his own savings, George managed to pull together enough to lease a storefront next door to the Piggly Wiggly, but not enough to fill the empty shelves. He turned to the Lakeland Grocery Company for $1,300 of merchandise on credit to stock his shelves. But the night before his big opening, the wholesaler, Mr. J.A. Powell, called George and asked that he be paid $1,000. George explained that he did not have the money. Powell told him to write a check. It would not clear the bank until Monday. A nervous George wrote a check for non-existent funds.
Fortunately for him, the sales for that weekend was $1,600, and the check was able to clear on Monday. He was very relieved about that.
It was a small self-service store with dry goods, local produce, and a butcher counter that offered fresh meats. George settled in with his small staff and set out to best the competition. But he quickly learned that pleasing the customer was going to be more important to his long-term success.
I was visiting a store within the last couple of years in Winter Haven, and a customer came up to me and he wanted to tell me about his relationship with George Jenkins. And this guy was 101 years old. And he told me stories about how unique George Jenkins was in that first store, how he would really work the city and tell people about how he just opened his store and invite them to come shop with him, and how he knew all of those customers. He would hear a name and he would know that name the next time he saw them. This guy was telling me all this stuff. That's pretty special. That's pretty special.
Piggly Wiggly did all it could to run George out of business, bringing in its best store manager from Miami, with a reputation as a charmer to keep the ladies shopping with them. But Publix was cleaner, homier, and cheaper, and George was committed to making it work.
Whatever Piggly Wiggly did, my father would do one better. They would cut their prices, and my father would cut his prices. My father gave away $5 gold pieces to the first 10 customers that bought $10 of groceries. And even on one Friday and Saturday, he gave away 300 dozen gladiolas to his customers. And so he went over to the Piggly Wiggly store and he looked inside. He didn't see a single customer.
3 years later, in 1933, Piggly Wiggly closed its doors. It was the first of many victories against those who would, through the years, try to knock Publix down. But the darkest days of the Depression were still ahead, and the hard work was just beginning. George later recalled, "We swept the floor, dusted the stock, pulled the wilted leaves from the lettuce, sprinkled the turnip greens, and smiled at the few customers we did have."
He told me he opened the store every day at 7 o'clock and often worked till midnight stocking the store. He had to carry 100-pound bags of potatoes down an alley to reach the back room. And in 1 year, he told me he worked every day of the year, 365 days. Well, every year he made a little money and increased his ability to open a better store.
Dear Charlie, I was surprised to hear of you getting married. I guess I must have started something. Lee and I are fond of Mildred and hope you will be as happy as we are. In 1940, George wrote to his brother Charlie to congratulate him on his wedding and to share news of his own. Now an established grocer, George Jenkins married Lee Savings from Texas and adopted her 7-year-old daughter, Dolores.
She went to the movie theater and was standing in line, and behind her was George Jenkins. And so that's how they met. I asked him about that one time, and he said, oh yeah, she was the best looking thing in line. He married my grandmother, and within about a year and a half, my grandmother passed away. And so one of the things that endears all of us to George Jenkins is the fact that here he married my grandmother, adopted my mother immediately, and then my grandmother passes away within a year and a half, and yet he raised this adopted daughter. He took on this obligation, and he never turned his back on it.
Since he first opened Publix in 1930, George was consumed by one idea: to open the finest food store in the state of Florida.
So he spent 10 years thinking about things he could do to improve the store. And he traveled the country looking for ideas.
The Supermarket Institute had these conventions, and he traveled to various cities, and I know one of the chains he looked at was Penn Fruit in Philadelphia, and he copied some of the ideas he got from this operation.
The architect has just about finished the plans for my store. Guess I must be going in for too much fancy trimmings, as it's going to cost over $18,000. But it will be a honey. Florida's first supermarket was built of steel and concrete with glass brick and a marble front. The new Publix was packed with innovations that no one had ever put in a grocery store. In November of 1940, George was ready to open its doors. The night before his grand opening, he went across the street and sat on the church steps. He looked at the Publix and thought to himself, there'll never be a better store.
As a kid, and I don't remember how old, but not very old, my dad, who was working for All American, heard about this big new supermarket built over in Winter Haven. Electric-eyed doors, terrazzo floors, beautiful color inside, Muzak, all the things that nobody had ever heard of and imagined for supermarkets. And we went over there one Sunday on our ride about in a 1934 Plymouth to see this store.
It was the first supermarket to have air conditioning. It was also the first one to have what we called electric eye doors. And that's where if a customer passed through this eye, the doors would automatically open. He had seen it in New York at Grand Central Station, and he decided to put it in his supermarket. And customers really marveled at this new system that automatically opened the doors. But he did a lot of things that were really a step up from what had been normal in the business. As a matter of fact, he put so much granite in his store that some of his competitors derided him as calling his first store the Marble Palace.
The odds were still astronomical that this 1940 store would be able to make it, because in ground, building, equipment, and merchandise, we had gone on the cuff with what little we had to about $75,000. One of the meat salesmen came in one day and he looked around. He says, "This is a beautiful store." Joe Dees, if you remember the Wilson Company, Joe. He said, "I bet you got about $75,000 in here." I said, "You just about hit it on the head." He said, "Well, if I had $75,000, I sure wouldn't want a grocery store." I said, "Joe, if I had $75,000, I wouldn't want a grocery store either."
My mother talked to us about her dad and how difficult it was in the early days for Publix. She recalls for dinner sometimes he would just bring home dented cans and he would bring home cans without the paper labels, because at that time all the labels were paper, and they would not know what they were going to have for dinner. That they would just open these cans, and whatever was in the cans is what they had for dinner.
At that time, no prudent man would have put any money into this 1940 model, because we had marble on the front, and the bankers were sure we were going broke. And there was an A&P supervisor was working for A&P across the street. He came over and said, "I know you're not going to make it here, but when you do get ready to close, I wish you'd give A&P an opportunity to take over this building." That's just the kind of burr I needed under my tail to show somebody something. Well, I have to admit, if the war hadn't come along, I don't know what would have been the future of Publix. But they established an Army base there at Bartow, and prices began to go up, and I hawked my life insurance and all I could get a hold of, and stockpiled some merchandise, and the price kept going up, and we managed to get things going a little smoother.
George Jenkins' Marble Palace had become a tourist attraction in Winter Haven by the mid-1940s, but the weekly sales were only $5,000. And Jenkins knew that to succeed, he needed to expand. He opened a second supermarket nearby and brought on his brother Charlie to manage it.
At the end of the war, George invited my dad to come to Florida to work for him, and thank God he did. And his first assignment was a store in a little town called Lake Wales, which is about 25 miles from Lakeland.
Well, Charlie did a really great job of managing that store, and as the company grew, he took on more responsibilities, and he became the chief purchasing officer of Publix.
In 1945, not long after opening his second store, a golden opportunity came along. In Lakeland, 19 rundown, shabby stores, the Lakeland Grocery Company and the All-American chain owned by his friend J.A. Powell, were up for sale.
Well, Publix had been buying its groceries from the Lakeland Grocery Company for about 15 years, and he developed a relationship with Mr. Powell, and Mr. Powell respected my father as being an innovative businessman. And so when he decided to sell his chain, he sold it to my father for $50,000 less than what he would have gotten from a competitor. And Mr. Powell thought that my father would take care of the employees of the company better than any competitor.
With a purchase price of $175,000, payable to Mr. Powell at $20,000 a year, George took his biggest risk yet, buying the All-American stores and making them profitable enough to liquidate his debt.
It was quite obvious that he didn't intend to take our stores, the All-American, and leave them as they were, because they were way behind what he was already doing in the store.
My father was interested in the Lakeland Grocery Company because it had a distribution center and it had a full staff. And he thought by buying this company that had been in business for many years, he could make a giant leap forward.
With this purchase, George had gone from 2 stores to 21 stores, acquired a distribution center, and a team to help him run it all.
The most important person that came along with that acquisition was Joe Blanton, who later became the president of Publix. Joe Blanton was a person who liked to get up at 6 in the morning and go to work, and if he could find enough work to do until 10 or 12 at night, he was really happy. When I was working for him at age 25, I was amazed that I was having a hard time keeping up with him. He pushed everyone at Publix to get more done.
We would drive to Jacksonville early in the morning, say leaving at 6 o'clock, look at store locations all day, maybe leave up there at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and get home by 2 in the morning. and get up and go to work the next morning at 7 o'clock. Well, I was Joe Blanton, and that's no sacrifice for Joe. That's just a normal day's work for him. But it could get old for the average fella, you know.
Joe Blanton was not only well respected at Publix, he was well liked. He touched almost every area of the company, including his original job, which was in the meat department. Joe was in charge of real estate, construction, and what we call equipment. He had tremendous expertise in all these areas, and was quite amazing to me that a self-taught man would have this much knowledge.
Well, Joe was a great right-hand man for my father. He respected him, he was loyal to him, and he never wanted to disappoint him on anything he did.
I think the greatest ability that he has is the ability to make people want to work for him. He makes it possible for you to work your heart out to accomplish things, and he gives you the credit for doing it, and makes you realize that you've done a good job.
George Jenkins and his new team set out to transform the All-American stores into a supermarket chain. By 1948, the spruced-up All-American stores reached sales of $7 million a year. George was getting the volume he needed to grow the Publix chain and the profits to pay back Mr. Powell. Just as he had in the 1930s, George toured the country, looking for new ideas as he began to replace the old A&A stores with the modern supermarkets that were becoming the hallmark of the Publix brand.
His standards were so high. It was almost like a perfection. Like when he wanted to have the cleanest store in town, which he did. He wanted to have the best service. His standards were very, very high, and that really set him apart. He didn't just do enough to get by. He was going to be the absolute best in whatever he did.
Mr. George always liked to read and keep up with everything in the supermarket business. He kept up with all the other supermarkets, how they were doing and what they were doing. Actually, he bought a little bit of stock in all of the supermarkets so he would get the annual report to know how they were doing.
He's the one that did most of the real estate work. He knew the size of the store, he knew the market he was in. He had that much knowledge of the business as it was at that time.
As important as his knowledge of the business and his commitment to excellence were to running Publix, it was George's understanding of retail as a people business that laid the groundwork for Publix success.
Certain professions, you've got to be proficient in your profession. And whether you have a nice personality, like people, to get along with people, is not the important thing. But in the retail business, you have to get along with people. I don't have to know the contents of all the cans. It's better that if you know what you're selling and all. But his success is based mainly on how he impresses the customers and the service he gives them, and not on some technical knowledge that he might know about the business.
He firmly believed that the success of a store depended on the footprints of the owner on the floor of the store. And his footprints were all over Publix stores. He was in the stores constantly. He would chat with the customers all through the store and help them find things, find merchandise.
You know, everybody talks about that. The customer's number one, you got to take care. Oh no, this was his blood. This is what he believed.
His idea of customer service wasn't just a matter of going and fetching something for the customer. He would actually entertain the customer. If a woman came in the store, he would compliment her on her dress, ask her how her family was doing. So it was actually a great outing for the customer to come in and talk to George.
You know.
You've got to make raving fans out of your customers. And if you're going to do that, you've got to make raving fans out of your associates. They've got to really believe in what they're doing and get excited about it.
He never went into a store that he didn't shake hands or speak to just about every associate in the store. He looked at his associates as being something far more valuable than just doing the job.
Mr. Jenkins has
a kind of a fellow that once you meet him, you just almost immediately feel like you've always known him. He just puts you completely at ease. And you can just tell from just meeting him just a few minutes that he's a great humanitarian.
In August 1947, George Jenkins took his new bride on honeymoon to Cuba. Ann McGregor from Marietta, Georgia, was 23. While attending Emory University, she joined the United States Army Nurse Corps during World War II. George had met Ann, a friend of the Jenkins in Atlanta, while on a visit home and was immediately taken by her. She later told her daughter, Julie, she found George handsome, like Tyrone Power. The Jenkins settled in Lakeland to start a family. Julie, born in 1949, came first, followed by Howard, Kenneth, Nancy, Carol, and David, the youngest, born in 1959.
I have a lot of memories of my mother being at home because she did care a lot about the six of us and keeping us engaged in all sorts of activities. So she was really gracious, social, seemed to enjoy that role.
We enjoyed spending time with my father on the weekends. He took us hunting and fishing and to the movies, and we really enjoyed that a lot, but we hardly ever saw him on the weekdays.
You don't get to have breakfast with your family and then have dinner with your family the same day, you know, and be with them in the evening if you run in any kind of business.
He was always there for us. You ever had a problem, he was always there. Kind, ready to solve it, gentle.
And humor.
Yeah.
A lot of humor. And, you know, he would sing to us at night, you know, good night, ladies. You'd be hearing that down the hall.
Oh, yeah. Hello, Dolly, when he'd take a shower.
He took the older kids when we were very young to the office. That's what he thought babysitting was. We would like break his dictaphone machine, break his adding machine, go around. I'm told I pulled the feathers out of his pheasant.
The pheasant.
So we'd go down and he would be working and we'd be going around the offices, exploring and doing things and usually breaking things, but that's what he did with us.
By 1954, with 28 stores serving a 70-mile radius around Lakeland, the Publix chain had become a reality. It was anchored by a 125,000 square foot warehouse and corporate headquarters. By the late 1950s, with 5,000 families moving to the Sunshine State every month, Florida's population had exploded.
The vision that George Jenkins had was unbelievable. And I think he had, whatever point of time he might have been in, from that point, he was able to look forward into something much, much greater than what other people saw. And he talked a little bit about it. I mean, he knew the company was growing. He just wanted to take a very conservative approach to it, meaning not take on a lot of debt, but try to grow as quickly as he could as the state of Florida was growing.
In the late 50s, we came upon for lack of a better word, a format for a store. And I can recall Mr. Jenkins calling in and he says, lay out a store that you think would be just perfect for this market today. And they did. And he said, okay, now build a wall around it. And he came up with the store which really put us into mass retailing, and it was called the 21M. A store 21,120 square feet, and we used that store for the backbone of Publix for many years.
To choose the sites for the new stores, George Jenkins and Joe Blanton would fly around in a helicopter observing housing and traffic patterns. A busy thoroughfare with the potential growth of 2,000 families within a 2-mile radius became the ideal location.
You almost had to pick the site before the homes were built. So Joe had really good contacts in the real estate industry where he could find out where they were going to build a lot of houses, and he would follow that around, and we would often build a store before the houses were even there.
Expanding at a rate of 10 stores per year, the Publix chain grew to 50 stores by 1960, mostly in Central Florida. Profits reached $1 million for the first time. As George planned his next move, he began to look at Miami as Publix's next target of growth.
People would come in and say, George, you don't want to go to Miami. It's a dogfight down there. You've got so many supermarkets down there. They got them every block, and it's hard market, it's tough. And Mr. Jenkins says, yes, there are a lot of markets in Miami, but there's not enough good ones. We were successful down there because Mr. Jenkins saw to it that we ran a better store than everybody else.
George's expansion into Miami got a boost when an unexpected opportunity arose during a game of golf.
Well, he was playing golf one day with the chairman of Grand Union down south at some industry meeting, and negotiated the purchase of the Grand Union stores in Florida. I believe there were 6 of them, 5 on the southeast coast and 1 in Bradenton. The week that they reopened as Publix, Mr. George went to every store, every former Grand Union store, and told the employees, you double the sales volume of this store and you hold that volume for 6 weeks, and I'll bring you a double paycheck. That made an impression.
In 1964, Publix 100th store opened in Winter Haven, the same city where George Jenkins had opened the first Publix in the depths of the Depression 34 years before.
When I was 13, I went to the grand opening of the 100th store. And that was where my father had gotten the whole family to come down to the grand opening. And it was really quite a celebration for Publix. No one believed that Publix would ever have 100 stores. So this was really exciting for everyone to see the 100th store open.
He loved the business. You know, he didn't go to all these stores and store openings and all that because he had to. He did it because he loved it. To be in the stores, to see the people, to watch the people grow. He loved to watch it. He loved to talk about the little bitty guy that he hired that now was running a produce department or the grocery department. He loved those stories. And he loved to give people those opportunities.
I enjoy the business, and the thing I enjoy most is seeing people develop, though. I don't, haven't for years, paid too much attention about the knowledge of groceries, that end of it. But to watch these young fellows work in high school and get out, maybe get a couple years of college, maybe not, doesn't really matter, and go to work and then work up to be a store manager. To see people develop like that, that's the pleasure I get.
To think that a company would take the chance, if you will, on somebody at 16 years old, having an opportunity to come and work for a company as a bagger and a front service clerk today, as we would call them, and give them the opportunity to grow into the next layer of responsibility. I can't be more thankful of what Mr. George visioned for this company, to have this promotion from within opportunity for all of us. It's just what makes Publix Publix.
As Publix continued to grow, 193 stores by 1974, reaching $1 billion in sales for the first time, George knew this success owed much to the 20,000 Publix associates and to the fact that many of them were stockholders in the company.
In the early 30s, he made all the employees at his first store owners of the company. He said he'd sell them $100 worth of stock, and they could pay for it over a year's time at $2 a week. And then he gave them all a $2 a week raise. And so they paid for it and became owners of it, and it was a great investment for them.
In 1974, he formalized the Employee Stock Ownership Program at Publix, giving stock to every employee who worked 1,000 hours a year for the company.
He really believed in ownership of the company, that sharing in the profits of the store and profits of the company was really important to him. He was ahead of his time in that respect, but he knew the power of it.
He believed that if his associates had a stake in what they were doing for their customers, that everybody would join together in providing better service. It all has to do with the service levels and the commitment to quality that Mr. George wanted everybody in that company to have a part of.
His success was recognized in 1978 when he was honored with the Sidney Rabb Award, the most prestigious in the supermarket industry.
Mr. Jenkins was presented with that award for not only his commitment to build one of the greatest supermarket companies in our country, but for his commitment to his associates, for his commitment to his community, and for the commitment to the industry.
1980 marked Publix's 50th anniversary. George, now in his 70s and still firmly in control, began to lay plans for the future of Publix.
It would be easy for me to talk all night with you about the past 50 years. But as much as you like to reminisce, I'm reminded of what Shakespeare said, the past is only a prelude to the future. So more importantly than celebrating 50 years is for us to lay plans for the future.
From an early age, George's son, Howard, had been groomed to be a leader at Publix. Ordered to report to work in 1966 at age 16, Howard worked in many store positions, including bagger, stocker, and meat cutter.
I was working as an assistant manager at Store 150 in Tallahassee, and my father gave me a call and told me that he wanted me to come into headquarters because he and Joe needed to teach me the business.
Steeped in Publix's tradition of innovation, Howard learned the business from the legendary Joe Blanton and began to breathe new life into Publix.
When I came to work with Publix in 1980, the reins were being passed to Howard from Mr. George in terms of being the leader in innovation. That's what you saw were the new things that were being done. Howard had a hand in all of that.
George also wanted to ensure the future of his charitable foundation by bringing his youngest daughter, Carol, onto the board.
It was just wonderful that I had the opportunity to start my journey based on what his passion was about.
George Jenkins had an unbelievable heart and generosity that I think people are very, very aware of. They saw what he did, but in so many ways, there was everything that people see. There was probably so much more that they never saw.
The roots of that were back in the way that he was raised as a child, and very much biblically, and this expectation that to whom much is given, much be required, and he translated that into a responsibility to take whatever his genius produced and benefit other people with it.
Through his foundation, Jenkins contributed to numerous organizations, including the Boy Scouts, Salvation Army, cerebral palsy research, and various educational institutions.
United Way was always a focus of Mr. George, and in 1996 actually won the Spirit of America Award which goes to the company who best displays their allegiance to the United Way effort. The success of our United Way campaign really depends on the efforts of our folks in the stores and warehouses and office locations around the company. So he would be very proud of that.
In the 1980s, the supermarket industry was undergoing a transformation, and competition was getting stiffer. After decades of leading the industry, the growth of Publix had stalled, and in some places its share of the market was beginning to shrink.
Throughout the whole 80s, Publix was operating only in Florida. And people knew Publix was doing well. And so many thought they could come into Florida and do better. Just a tremendous amount of competition, and that's what put the pressure on innovation in that decade and then the time beyond that.
A lot of the older management were looking at the past and the almost impossible things they had done, and were not looking toward the future.
Publix was right to be proud of what Publix had done and what Publix did. Now you're coming with a message that says we need to be willing to re-examine everything. And we need to improve. Well, you can imagine that creates some tension.
Well, I was really concerned about Publix being able to compete in the future and put forth lots of ideas that would enable Publix to work better.
Howard's ideas were often met with resistance from leadership and board members, none more than his plan to open Publix on Sundays.
Back in 1975, store 150 in Tallahassee was by far Publix's largest volume store. And Albertsons was across the street, and they had a really great store across the street. And because we were not opened on Sunday, Albertsons did a lot of business on Sunday. And it really bothered me to see Albertsons being so successful on Sunday while we were closed. So I talked to my father about opening on Sunday, and he really didn't warm up to the idea very much, and he said, well, we'll just stay closed as long as we can.
Competition was gaining on Publix, and in 1981, Publix profits declined for the first time in 30 years. George agreed. Publix needed to open on Sundays.
The rest of the management team didn't want to open on Sunday, and they talked my father into trying different things to see if other things could be done. And nothing really worked. So in 1984, we did open the stores on Sunday.
As times changed, the demands of, with two income families, Sunday was a good day to shop. And if you're really going to serve your customers, you have to be there when they want you to be there. So as difficult as it was, from a business standpoint, he knew he had to make it.
After opening on Sundays, Publix sales and profits increased dramatically. Then, in 1984, Joe Blanton died of a sudden heart attack. Blanton's commitment and expertise at Publix had been unrivaled. I always knew I had a genius in Joe Blanton, George once said of his right-hand man. But Blanton's spirit lived on in the commitment of the young men he had once mentored. Howard continued to push for innovations as the younger generation gained influence. He began lobbying his father to increase Publix's rate of expansion to meet the competition head-on.
Albertsons just was committed to this combination store that had pharmacy and some other departments that Publix had not emphasized or hadn't participated in.
We found that the younger customers were shopping at the combination stores and the older customers were shopping with Publix. And we didn't think that was a good thing for the future of Publix. Well, I led a team of people to design a 56,000 square foot store that would replace the smaller 21,000 square foot store. And this would allow us to sell a lot more merchandise than we had previously been able to fit into the store. When I presented this to the board of directors voted against it. But fortunately, my father said, well, we'll try one just to prove it won't be successful.
But the new combination store concept was very successful. When the 21M stores were replaced by the new, larger combination stores, sales would usually double.
We saw that the combination stores was a very successful concept for Publix. And with Charlie Jr. being in charge of store development, we just started building combination stores more and more as time went on.
With a renewed emphasis on innovation, Publix regained its sales momentum in the Florida market. Then, in 1989, the associates suffered a major shock. Mr. George, still head of Publix at the age of 82, suffered a stroke.
It was just a stroke. You have strokes in which you can't move your arm and your leg, and his stroke went to a part of the brain that deals with communication, and he just could not communicate.
When I heard Mr. Jenkins had been afflicted with a stroke, I and many of my coworkers were sad to the point of tears in many cases, because it was so distressing to see this great man who still in his head had all this tremendous knowledge and all this ability and all the memories that he had, and not be able to express them.
So it was a terribly sad thing for all of us around it. Terribly sad.
Well, after my father had his stroke, I went over to the hospital to see him, and I was really shocked to see the condition he was in. The whole family was very upset that he was in this condition, but we'd hoped that he would be able to improve and recover, but we found out that his speech was not recovered and he wasn't able to communicate.
With Mr. George unable to return to work, the transition to a new generation at Publix was now complete.
The family got together and we had a voting trust for the Publix stock, and we elected a new board of directors, and we elected a new executive committee.
Named CEO, Howard and his new team prepared Publix to face the many challenges ahead.
The executive committee was made up of Charlie Jenkins Jr., Mark Hollis, Barney Barnett, and Bill Vass. And as a team, we started to chart the future of Publix. We knew that there was a lot of competition coming into Florida, especially the Walmart Supercenter. And we knew that Publix would have to improve on everything it did if we were going to survive this new competition.
I always felt about Publix that once Publix identified somebody as a competitor, Publix would compete very well against them. Ultimately would be able to defeat them in terms of what they were trying to do. But Walmart initially was sort of off the radar screen, and there was an effect on Publix's business. There were several people who saw that effect, but we went through a planning process at the end of the 80s, and as part of that process, we and some people who helped us studied very carefully what was going on, particularly with Walmart.
The executive committee knew that Walmart was expanding into the grocery business, and they were offering the customer a really great value. We knew that we were going to have to increase the size of Publix to get the same kind of economy of scale that Walmart was receiving. So the executive committee got together and we developed a plan to open 1,000 stores. We knew that in order to do that, we would have to expand outside the state of Florida. So we started making our plans to do everything we did at Publix better than we'd ever done before.
You want a store that takes pride too.
In 1991, Publix opened its first store in Georgia, taking George Jenkins' company to his home state. Ed Crenshaw was sent to Atlanta to oversee the expansion.
That first decision to go outside of the state really happened after his stroke that he had in 1989. And but he was very well aware of the fact that we were going outside of the state, and I think initially he wasn't too happy with us for making that decision. But once we did it, he embraced it. He was very proud of the stores that he was able to come up and see in Georgia, in Atlanta specifically. He was very proud of them.
He came down frequently to the Miami Division in his wheelchair, and we'd wheel him around to the stores. And of course, everybody knew him, everybody. He would go in the store and wave like that, and people would come over and just hug him and kiss him. Such a tremendous outpouring of love and affection you've never seen in your life. Not just from the Publix people to him, but from him to them. You could feel it. It was palatable almost. You could taste it in the air that this man, although infirmed, was still a great man.
In 1996, Publix mourned the loss of their beloved Mr. George. But in the years after his death, the company he built continued to embody the values that Mr. George had put in place when he opened his first Publix in Winter Haven in 1930.
What happens with organizations over time is most of them lose their sense of purpose. When you move from somebody like Mr. George, who had such a vision of what he wanted and why he was in business and what he wanted to be to customers and associates, all that sort of thing, most organizations lose that sense. It's about customers, it's about your associates, it's about community, and those things that meant a lot to him. I mean, at the end of the day, it's something bigger than doing business. It's bigger than how much you make on each transaction or what your stock is worth and all of those kinds of things. I mean, part of his genius was this notion of how Publix fit into something that's larger than Publix.
He was such a people person, and his goodness and his generosity, I want to remember, really came from his heart. It wasn't because he was trying to get his name in a newspaper. In fact, he really didn't like that so much, but he did it from the heart.
Every store you go in has his picture. You know how unusual that is? A little bitty guy from South Georgia doing what he did, not doable. But it's a great American story by a great person. I was privileged to know him.